I caught my parents recording my private conversations, then used them to manipulate me. I'm Naya, I'm 31, and I'm a privacy compliance analyst who spends her days telling companies that we only collected a little bit is not a defense and we didn't mean to is not a policy. And it is one of the stranger ironies of my life that while I was auditing strangers for creeping too far into customers' lives, my own parents were creeping into mine with a smile, a casserole, and a baby monitor hidden inside a ceramic diffuser shaped like a little white lotus. I want to tell you exactly how I found it because the moment of discovery matters. It reframed not just what they did but almost everything that had felt off for an entire year. Every lucky guess of my mother's, every I had a feeling from my father, every uncanny conversation where they arrived already armed with the answers to questions I hadn't told anyone I was asking. When you're raised by people who call themselves protective in a voice that feels like a hug and a chokehold at the same time, you learn to second-guess yourself as an act of respect. But I also learned how to write incident reports that get executives to stop breathing for a minute, and that turned out to be useful at my own kitchen table. This began the way so much modern weirdness does, with a glitch that felt too small to name. My mother started texting me precisely as my phone buzzed for calendar alerts she shouldn't have known about. Good luck at the 3:30, she'd write, just as my screen flashed meet 3:30 p.m. vendor call. She knows I keep a full schedule. In my family you don't call between 9 and 6 unless it's a death or a leak, so the first time she did it I thought okay, she remembers what day of the week it is. By the 5th time I made a joke, are you plugged into my calendar now? She laughed with an innocence so clean I tasted soap. Dad just happened to stop by with ladders the day I told my friend Zoe I needed to change the bulbs, except I'd told Zoe in a whispered rant while we were out for a walk at night and I hadn't said a word to my parents. It's that time of year, he said cheerfully, brandishing a step stool. I figured with your ceiling height you'd need help. His 61 retired civil engineer, lives for projects. Men like my dad build things rather than speak to them directly, which can be tender, a birdhouse when you're sad, an oil change when you're heartbroken, and can also be a kind of theater. I might have let it all slide into the whatever bucket if the comments had stayed sweet, but then they started to warp. I had an argument with my boyfriend at the time, Arun, on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of argument where two people who love each other fail to synchronize patience. Sunday morning my mother called me from her kitchen with the tone that means she has prepared a warm opinion. Baby, she said, maybe don't use that tone on him. Men have egos, you'll scare him. I stood by my window staring at the jacaranda tree and felt my spine go very cold. I didn't tell you we fought, I said. She paused, then covered it with the sort of bright lie people use like a napkin. Oh, mothers know things. What did I say? I asked, testing her. She laughed. You know how you get. Sharp. It was specific enough to feel like an answer, vague enough to be unfalsifiable. My father weighed in later with a text styled as a platitude. Marriage is compromise, try listening more, and I remember setting my phone down like it was a hot plate and thinking, what did you hear and how? I'm careful. That's not just a personality adjective, it's a job requirement. I have two-factor authentication on everything that touches my life. My email, my bank, my social apps, even the calendar tied to my grocery list requires a second tap. I don't save passwords in browsers and I treat public Wi-Fi like a rumor. When I wondered if someone had gotten into my accounts, it felt like doubting my hands. I pulled audit logs from the services I use, suspicious sign INS, which devices, where. Nothing. No new devices, no unusual IPs, no SMS codes I hadn't requested. The map of my digital footprint looked normal. I went through Arun's devices because part of being careful includes being honest about the ways people you love can still be callous. He handed them over with a wounded look that made me both grateful and annoyed at my brain. Nothing there either. I ran a spyware scan on my phone even though iOS is a fortress with known holes. Clean. So the data wasn't leaking from my phone, either someone was guessing with supernatural luck, or they were listening to the physical air. You can see in hindsight, right? It's like when I'm reviewing incident timelines and the moment that didn't seem important suddenly lights up like a runway. That diffuser. The little ceramic lotus in my living room shelf that my mother brought over because it relaxes me and you always need to relax more. I had plugged it in, watched the soft mist curl, thought, okay, spa vibes, and then almost never turned it on again because my apartment already smells like citrus hand soap and a candle I can never find again because the company went out of business. It sat there obediently, decor. It was a week after the "don't use that" tone call that I finally walked over to it with a feeling like I get before a presentation when I know a VP is going to ask a question I can answer. The bass felt light but not empty. I held it to my ear not because I expected to hear breathing like in a movie but because sometimes your body wants drama, and I heard nothing. Nothing. The kind of nothing that is suspicious. At my desk drawer I keep a cheap hobbyist screwdriver set for when I want to take apart small things to understand them. The Lotus base had a seam. 4 tiny screws. I sat cross-legged on my rug and unscrewed my mother's gift while my own breath sounded too loud, as if I were already on a recording. Inside was a nest of wires and a black rectangle I recognized immediately, a Wi-Fi baby monitor board, the kind sold by 100 Amazon sellers under names like Feathercloud and Night Owl. There was a tiny electret microphone soldered to a lead and glued in place with the kind of glue my father would definitely choose, a microSD card. I didn't say anything. It's funny what I did next. I took a picture. I guess because I needed proof for my future self. Then I pulled the card, slid it into the adapter in my laptop, and watched a directory bloom full of files named by date, hundreds of them. Because these devices are greedy by design, they never met a moment they didn't think was theirs to keep. I clicked the most recent. The audio opened in the default player with a little wave squiggle, and then there we were, me and Arun arguing while making chana masala, this expensive intimacy flattened to 44 kilohertz and a thumbnail. "You don't hear me," my recorded self said, and it felt like she was talking to the version of me who was listening. The file before that was me on the phone with Zoe. The one before that was me singing badly to a playlist while sorting laundry. I wanted to vomit and scrub my skin and burn my furniture and also, absurdly, preserve the evidence like a lab tech. My first thought was not, "I'm going to confront them." It was, "How far is this?" And that's a sentence you should picture on a whiteboard in my brain with red circles around it. I scrolled back in time, 2 months, 6 months, nearly a year. They'd been listening since my move. There were gaps. The monitor must have been on a schedule. The files were heavily compressed, which means detail was lost but content remained. I clicked a file at random from 9 months ago and heard myself crying while reading an email from my boss that said, "Let's circle back." If you've ever cried over corporate euphemisms, you know it's not the words, it's what they stand in for. I clicked another and heard my mother's voice, not through the phone, not in my living room, but faint in the background of the recording because she had been speaking in my apartment while I was in the bathroom, and the monitor had recorded the conversation she was having with my father while they stopped by to water the pot hose. "At least we can keep an eye," she said, and he murmured, "It's for her own good," and I closed the laptop like it had teeth. You know the feeling when someone insists you wear a sweater because they're cold? Surveillance is the sweater they force over your head and then ask you to thank them for. 2 hours later I was slightly calmer and a lot more meticulous. I copied the entire card to an encrypted drive because if I've learned anything, it's that people who betray you will insist the betrayal never happened if you don't have the receipts. I then did a thing I am not proud of but will not apologize for. While my hands were still shaking, I went to my parents' house. Not to confront. To take inventory. My parents live in the same mod split level they bought when I was in kindergarten, flowering quince by the walkway, a porch where packages collect like orphan stories. They were at church, I knew because the car was gone and because my mother had texted me a quote from the homily, a weekly ritual she uses to remind me to be less stubborn with the Lord. I have a key. I let myself in and the smell of cinnamon and lemon cleaner did that thing where it turns you temporarily into your younger self. I breathed through it and went room by room. The home assistant devices on the counter, those speakers that listen far more than they speak, had their microphones taped, a habit I had installed years ago and which made me briefly proud of my past self. In the study, though, there was a drawer with a new lock on it. It looked silly because it was the only locked drawer in a house full of unlocked Goodwill. I am my father's daughter. I picked it with one of the paperclip tricks he taught me while telling me never to use it for evil. Inside, 2 more microSD cards, a laminated instruction sheet for a Wi-Fi baby monitor, a logbook written in my mother's neat teacher handwriting with dates and notes, "N had late night cried." A came over, sounded argumentative but later laughing. Z stopped by, sounded tense, maybe job trouble. As if she were journaling about weather. The care in those loops and curls felt like a betrayal all its own. She had logged me like a symptom. There were also 2 USB sticks labeled backup kitchen and backup living room, which told me the diffuser Lotus wasn't the only device. When I came back to my place, I found, with hands that had learned the shape of deceit, a second microphone inside the base of the floor lamp. My father had drilled the hole with delicate precision, sanded it so I wouldn't feel an edge, fed the wire through the hollow stand and snapped it back together with a practiced engineer's click. I sat down on the floor and laughed like a person who knows the punchline and hates it. I did not shout. I didn't even call. I texted my mother, "Come by at 6. Bring Dad." She sent 3 heart emojis and "Will there be dinner?" as if we were starting a sitcom. I responded, "No." For 3 hours I paced like a courtroom attorney with a closing statement I didn't want to give. I thought of every time they had used a piece of information as if their knowing it proved something about my choices. "You sound lonely, marry him. You sound overwhelmed, move home. You sound angry, that's not attractive." I thought of the way my mother often used the phrase "save you from yourself," the way my father would sigh and ask, "Can we please be practical?" with a tone he only ever used when I was being emotional in ways he found inconvenient. A special rage lives at the intersection of paternalism and surveillance. I felt it bloom in my chest like a bad flower. They arrived at 6:08, Mom in a cardigan even in summer because she believes in layers like they are theology, Dad in his world's okayest grandpa t-shirt even though there are no grandchildren because humor is his shield. I didn't ask them to sit. I pointed to the coffee table where I had placed the disassembled Lotus, the micro SD card, the printed instructions, my mother's logbook, and a small speaker with a cable. "Press play," I said. My father squinted, then reached for the speaker like a man in a lab who has always been sure of which button to push. The room filled with my own voice saying, "I just need you to listen to me for once," and then Arun saying, "I am listening," and then the wet sound of onions frying, the hiss of life being ordinary. My mother's hand flew to her chest the way an actress's does. My father's face did something I can't describe, the micro-expression of a boy caught red-handed and not sorry yet. "Why?" I asked, without decoration. "Did you think this was okay?" If you've ever confronted someone who believes their love makes them right, you know the choreography. The first step is denial. "We didn't," my mother said, half-formed, and then, seeing the table, switched to justification so fast she would have pulled a hamstring if the human conscience were a muscle anyone used regularly. "It was just for safety," she said. "You live alone." "There is a door," I said. "I have locks. I have a phone. Safety is not a mic." My father cleared his throat with the sound that used to precede algebra explanations. "You know the world," he began, "and your job, you see what people do with data, you know how dangerous, which is why you chose to become the people." I said too fast because my mouth outran my mercy. He flinched. My mother tried another tack, tears, not fake, because she truly believed what she was about to say. "I couldn't sleep at night," she whispered. "I worried. It helped me. I needed to hear that you were okay." I pictured her going to bed with my voice in her ears like a pacifier and had to sit down before I said something irrevocable. "Listen to me," I said, and then had to laugh because that was the entire point of the files. They had listened to me more than anyone else in my life, and yet not really. They had captured my sounds and still refused my meaning. "This is not love," I said slowly. "This is control dressed up in a robe like love." "We never used it against you," my father said weakly, and I realized memory is merciful. He genuinely believed that. "You advised me on my relationships using quotes," I said. "You told me what I said before I told you I said it. You used my pain to steer me." "We were trying to save you from mistakes," my mother said, and I couldn't help it. I finally shouted, "From my life." The echo rang, and I saw her take it into her body like an arrow. "Do you know what I do all day?" I asked more softly. "I tell men in suits that collecting more than you need because it makes you feel powerful is not a policy. I tell them that minimization is love when it comes to people's lives. I tell them they can't shoot footage and then call it an apology. My father muttered, "We don't need a lecture," and I said, "I need you to hear it." Then I did the thing I do best, I brought out the plan. I set the conditions on the table like my own little Bill of Rights. "Here's what happens next," I said. 1. You bring me every single device you planted. 2. You hand over every copy, card, cloud, USB. 3. You apologize without the words if or but. 4. You attend 2 sessions with my therapist to understand boundaries. 5. You do not set foot in my apartment without my explicit invitation, which will not be often for a while. 6. You never again keep a log of my life as if you were a meteorologist. 7. For 3 months we will not speak unless you text me that you are ready to respect these rules and then demonstrate it. My mother stared at me with a kind of wonder that made me want to hug cruelly. "You made rules," she said, like she was meeting me. "Yes," I said. "We're a family, not a company," my father protested weakly, and I said, "Exactly, stop acting like you own my data." They brought devices. You would not believe the creativity. The diffuser. The lamp. A decorative clock. A talking photo frame that never talked but always listened. A power strip with something inside. I catalogued them on a sheet like a cop, and a part of me was embarrassed by the satisfaction I felt at being exactly the right person to handle my own crisis. They brought cards and USB sticks and even a battered old portable hard drive that looked like it had stories to tell. I connected each to my laptop, copy-pasted with clinical detachment, hashed them for integrity, zipped them into an archive I named with a date and 4 words, in case we forget. My mother cried again when I said that out loud. My father stood with his hands on his hips like a defeated foreman. When I finally said, "You can go," my mother asked, Tiny, "will we see you?" "Not soon," I said, and it hurt to say it. She nodded as if she were agreeing to a medical procedure and then hugged herself the way I've only seen her do in winter. I thought the worst was over. It wasn't. Boundary enforcement is the ugly part no one posts about. It requires a stamina I didn't know I had. For the first week they respected silence, which became a comfort so loud I started sleeping through the night with my shoulders unhooked from my ears. On day 8, my father sent a long email titled Context in which he explained their childhoods, the crime rate, my stubbornness, the Lord, my unmarried status, and the duty of parents to guard their children even when children are ill-equipped to guard themselves. I read it twice because I wanted to be fair to the fear under the arrogance. Then I annotated it like a student, line by line. This explains, not excuses. This is projection. This is unacceptable. I didn't send my annotated version. I sent one line, "This is not an apology." My mother tried a different door, sent a photo from when I was 9, hair crooked, gap-toothed grin, holding a science fair ribbon. "We built you," she wrote underneath it, as if that sentence outweighed everything. "And I am building me," I replied, and turned off my phone for the night like a ceremony. I did take them to my therapist though, 2 sessions that were less therapy than translation. The first session my mother wept and my father bristled while my therapist, a woman with a calm voice and terrifying precision, explained what an adult child is. "Your daughter is entitled to opacity," she said, and my parents looked genuinely baffled. "There are parts of her life you do not get to see because you want to." My father asked, wounded, "Do we get nothing?" And my therapist said, "You get what she offers. That is a gift. Your job is not to surveil. It is to be trustworthy enough to be brought in without force." In the second session, my mother said something that made me soften. "When you were born, I thought my job was to know you better than anyone," she said. "I'm having to learn that my job is to let you be knowable as you choose." We all cried at that one, even my father, who cried with irritation like he resented his ducts. He didn't apologize then, but the sentence made room in the room. Space is an apology's older, wiser cousin. You might want to know what I did with the recordings. I kept them. Not to listen to like a masochist or to sit with like a shrine, but because erasing them felt like letting my father's version win, the one where "we meant well" is the period at the end of the sentence. I catalogued them into 3 buckets: harmless noise, my terrible karaoke, my coffee grinder, me telling my plant to please thrive; domestic content, fights, laughter, phone calls, and violations, mom and dad in my space talking about me like an object. I deleted nothing at first because I wanted to see if I could hold the weight. Months later, I will tell you this, memory has scaled. I deleted everything except 3 files, my first and last arguments with Arun and one 6-minute recording of me alone humming, reading a chapter of a book out loud to see how it felt in my mouth. I kept those because they reminded me I had a voice even in captivity. I told Arun the whole story. We had broken up for reasons unrelated to microphones. We wanted different marriages, it turns out, mine quieter than his, but I wanted someone who knows me to witness the outline. He came over with kind eyes and a bottle of sparkling water like I was in recovery. He said, "I wish I'd been better for you when you were living inside their archive," and I said, "We were both doing our best with the maps we had." He laughed sadly. "Do you forgive them?" he asked, and I gave the only honest answer, in installments. Forgiveness, I realized, was going to be like paying off a loan I never asked for on a schedule I set. My parents faltered and then steadied. My mother stopped texting me as a weather report. My father stopped offering practical solutions to feelings I hadn't invited him into. They slipped 3 times, once when my mother called to ask if I was seeing that nice paramedic because I had mentioned in passing a ride-along program at work, once when my father forwarded me an article about women freezing their eggs with a subject line that read options as if my body were a missed exit, and once when my mother left a plant on my doorstep with a note that said "For peace" and also "We miss your noise," which is poetic until you remember that for a year their house had been full of my noise without me. Each time I pointed to the boundary like a road sign. "This is not okay," I texted. "Please stop," I said on the phone. "No," I wrote in an email, the period like a fence post. They course-corrected, slower at first, then with embarrassing eagerness like students who want a gold star. Meanwhile, I built a life with a new kind of lock on it that doesn't look like a deadbolt. I moved my router. I put tape over my laptop camera again even though rationally I know it's rarely the vector. Irrational safeguards are part of healing. I got rid of the diffuser and the lamp, not because I'm punishing objects but because my living room needed new shapes. I bought a ridiculous bright yellow kettle that whistles like a cartoon. I invited friends over and told them what happened so that I could watch their faces arrange into outrage and then something else, recognition. We started a little house ritual where we put our phones in a bowl and speak out loud a sentence we'd like not to ever be recorded. "I wish my mother liked me as much as she likes her dog," Zoe said once, and we all cheered because humor is a disinfectant. I started dating someone slowly, precisely, a widower named Khalil whose idea of romance is asking where to put his hands when I'm upset and then doing it exactly as requested. The first time he fell asleep on my couch, I watched him breathe and didn't wonder what microphones were hearing. I wondered how anyone ever thought that intimacy could be manufactured by stealing it. You're probably wondering if I ever played any of the recordings for my parents the way movies would demand, revenge via audio montage. I did once, not for revenge but for clarity. The file where they stopped by and logged me. I pressed play as we sat in their living room months later, after they had done most of the work and I had decided to let a little softness back into my voice. My mother covered her mouth as if to keep words from leaking out. My father stared at the floor where the wood has faded in a stripe from years of sunlight. We listened to her say she sounded sad today and to him say she'll make the wrong choice if we leave her, and then to my mother sigh a sigh I could almost love. When it ended she said, "I sound like someone who doesn't trust God," and he said, "I sound like someone who thinks he is God," and I sat there between them and felt the strangest thing, not triumph, not even peace. Just alignment, like the moment in a session where a child's tongue finally finds the roof of their mouth on the L and you hear the sound click into being. "You sound like people," I said. "Let's be people." They didn't turn me back quickly. That's the thing no one says. Even good apologies do not return the furniture to where it was. Our family dinners are shorter now, the conversations less prying, the laughter more honest. My father asks questions with a question mark instead of a thesis. My mother asks if she may give advice and then usually forgets what it was when I say no, which is a miracle I try not to examine too closely. We talk about books. We talk about the neighbor's grapevine that refuses to die. We talk about nothing. It is a relief. Sometimes my mother reaches across the table and squeezes my hand and says, "You're very brave," and I want to say, "No, I'm very tired," but sometimes bravery is exactly that. In my line of work, we tell companies to collect the least they need. It turns out families can learn minimization too. It makes room for more of the things that survive. There is one more thing I did that I should tell you because it made everything settle. I wrote down in a document titled Family Boundaries because creativity is for weekends, a list of what I consent to share and what I do not. It includes silly specifics, no commentary on my hair, and serious ones, no opinions on my body, my fertility, my finances unless I ask. It includes a clause about technology, no devices in my home without my explicit consent in writing. I printed it and we all signed it and laughed at ourselves like a second-rate board of directors. We then taped a copy on the inside of a kitchen cabinet at my mother's house where she keeps the Tupperware so she can look at it the next time she has an impulse to fix me with a gadget. When friends ask if that's overkill, I tell them, we draft contracts for people we trust in business. Why should family get less clarity? I wish I could give you a cinematic ending where I delete the last file and my parents nod redeemed. It's quieter than that. The last file is still in a folder on a drive in a drawer, named with a hash that makes it feel like what it is, memory rendered into math. I forget about it for weeks at a time now. Once, right after a hard day at work where a client told me users don't care, we've trained them to click accept, I came home and put my head on the table and cried in the way that embarrasses me less than it used to. My phone lit up with a text from my mother that read simply, "Today was long. Do you want soup?" And a part of me that had been clenched since forever unclenched a little. I texted back, yes, and when she came over with a pot and a real human face, I opened my door and let her in. We ate and talked about soup like it was a poem. She didn't ask what my tears were about. She didn't offer to solve anything. When she left, she looked around my living room like a person admiring a mural, and I knew she was thinking about how quiet it was and how she could really only hear what I wanted her to hear, and she smiled a small, proud, devastating smile and said, "Thank you for letting us grow up with you." I stood there in the doorway after she left and felt the rare, bright sensation of being watched only by the parts of the world that belong to everyone, light, dust, my own breath. If there's something I want to offer anyone who reads this and recognizes the shape of it, parents who call stalking safety, partners who call digging devotion, friends who call gossip concern, it's this: your right to privacy is not a mood. It is a boundary with a lock, and it can be learned and you can teach it. You do not have to become a compliance analyst to enforce it, but if you want to borrow my lines, take them: minimize, consent, purpose, transparency, accountability. They work at dinner tables too. And if you ever crack open a pretty ceramic gift and find a little black square where a flower should be, know that your shock will turn into inventory, your inventory into rules, your rules into room, and your room into a home again where the only recordings are the ones you make on purpose. The voice memos of songs you're trying to remember, the video of your friend laughing so hard she snorts, the soft sound of your own voice when you say to no one and everyone, "I am allowed to be unobserved and still be loved."